Hello, everyone, and welcome to Vision Zero Cities pop-up conference. My name is Suzan Shammari, and I'm the Manhattan organizer for Transportation Alternatives. I'm excited to moderate today's panel, Designing for Increased Accessibility. How do we design streets in which people of all ages and abilities can move about safely and enjoyably? Not only are our cities becoming more diverse, but so too are the uses of our streets. In the last decade alone, we've been seeing the rise of bike commuters, bike share, e-scooters, and e-bikes, as well as greater population of aging in place. In this session, we'll explore design techniques that increase accessibility and safety for all residents today and prepare cities for the changes to come. I want to give a warm welcome to our panelists this afternoon, Rob Berg, Principal at Design Workshop in Denver, Kimberly Leung, Engineer, Livable Streets Team Leader at SFMTA, and Maddie Ruvulo, Transportation Planner, Accessibility Services at SFMTA. Our first presentation for this afternoon will be Rob Berg. Rob Berg is a principal at Design Workshop in Denver and is known for the high value he places on individuals and teams. His 2 decades in planning and design have given him a deep appreciation of science and art of the built environment and a dedication to environmental stewardship and resiliency. He has focused in recent years on the design of the public realm and the realization of the public realm of this presentation. Rob will be leading, and Rob, I will hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Let me share screen here. Go full screen. There it is, sorry. Well, thank you for this opportunity and good afternoon. Again, my name is Rob Berg. I'm a principal and partner in Design Workshop. I sit in the Denver office. We are a planning and urban design and landscape architecture firm consisting of roughly 150 super intelligent individuals who care dearly about the public realm and changing the world for the better. The firm has been around for nearly 50 years and has grown to 8 studios across the country, allowing us to work on a very broad range of projects, both domestically and internationally. Our process involves approaching each project from a comprehensive perspective that involves more than just design, including the activation and programming and the operations and maintenance of the spaces that we get to work on. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 projects where we've reprioritized mobility and accessibility to allow for placemaking to occur. I'll be discussing our work at the Utah State University and in South Lake Tahoe. So first, let's talk a little bit about what it means to be in Logan, Utah at Utah State. We were asked to come to Logan, for me the first time arriving there, pretty special place set in the foothills there, to see what we could do to help restitch the Utah State campus back together again. What we found is a campus divided by a road designed to provide convenience for drivers at the expense of the true sense of campus and gathering. And this is very similar to what we've seen throughout the Midwest and on many college campuses. We learned that in the original master plan from 1912, it established 2 key accesses that link the key open spaces together on campus. But as, again, many campuses have evolved, that key spatial order dissolved with the post-war growth and emphasis on the automobile. So our intention and our goal was to refocus on a barrier-free campus core and repair the damage that was done. What we found is very similar to many university campuses throughout the country, a massive barrier to mobility, accessibility, and unity within the campus in the name of convenience and ease of service access. These numbers showed as suspected, a congested corridor that was prioritized for automobiles and their convenience, not pedestrians, and the safety and the movement of people. As you can imagine, working on a campus, a university campus, involves many stakeholders, from university leaders to public works departments, transit organizations, and so on and so forth. So many stakeholders, sometimes and most times with competing priorities. Sorry, not advancing. But they were all aligned around this common goal of providing safety for all users, which was the key thing that we kept bringing people back to. Our goal was to go all in on the idea of completely removing automobiles from the center of campus, providing a barrier-free mobility and returning to the original intent of the 1912 campus plan. This would allow a refocus of energy around nodes and points of crossing to provide safe access from North Campus to South Campus. To be clear, we were not recommending the removal of the campus transit circulator. That was one component that had to exist to provide sort of safe mobility to all parts of campus. Just we wanted to remove the personal automobiles. So we still needed to address things like access control, large and small crossings, and the potential of reimagining this corridor for festivals and student gatherings. So we quickly studied a number of alternative sections that involved four main components: pedestrian movement, bicycle circulation, transit circulation, and green stormwater infrastructure. The vision we were selling was this access-controlled center of campus that accommodated all beneficial modes of campus mobility, phased in over a period of time, as most campuses do, to retrain people into no longer viewing this as a barrier, but rather a place for people. As we look into the detail, a lot of what we were trying to do was to provide these safe nodes along Aggie Boulevard. We also incorporated inline bus stops and other mobility features, but this was really the point at which we were trying to stop the personal vehicles. And here's a crazy idea that you can actually train college students. What we discovered here was that by installing pedestrian controls, we could also reduce the number of pedestrian and transit conflicts. And you'd never believe that you could actually have a bunch of 20-somethings complying with those pedestrian controls. As you can see here, in the end, there were many compromises that had to be made on all sides of the tables. We didn't get everything. We would have loved to completely shut this portion of the campus down. But we do believe we've moved the needle closer to a unified campus that is safer than it is today. And now in this section of campus, we additionally are able to treat 100% of the stormwater that falls on the street. So thinking about streets as complete streets that serve more functions than just moving automobiles. And this is the vision that we're trying to create here. In this next project, this is another exercise in patience and compromise. We were asked to work with the city of South Lake Tahoe and the Tahoe Regional Planning Authority on what they were calling the Main Street Management Plan. But in reality, it was this project that for the first time in decades would actually create a true Main Street experience for South Lake Tahoe. Here's beautiful South Lake Tahoe. If you don't already know, South Lake Tahoe actually sits directly on the California-Nevada border. So what we're looking at here is the California side, and the border actually runs right through this intersection here. You're also looking at Highway 50, which is a 5-lane highway carrying thousands of vehicles a day through this. Many of these are throughputs not actually originating or ending in South Lake Tahoe. And this is looking at the Nevada side. just flipped around, and you can see the continuation of US 50. So the main reason for this management plan is due to the proposed relocation of Highway 50 in a bypass condition to the east of town. So it's basically down here as I'm tracing with my cursor around the central core. This is freeing up the heart of town for a new Main Street experience. And as you can imagine, this rerouting has taken nearly 20 years to go through the various federal reviews, and our Main Street management plan is one of the final conditions of approval for the entire project. With the town is split into three main areas or districts, each with their own identity and competing interests. From the left to the right, you start with the neighborhoods within the gateway zone. And here, the residents are looking for traffic calming, slower speeds, reduction in vehicle congestion from those high tourist automobile traffic. Next is the village core, which is, this is where much of the investment has been made into placemaking. The gondola comes right down into this plaza that will take you directly up to Heavenly Ski Area. And here they're looking for high visitor traffic or footfalls to activate the plaza and support the lodging and the retail. And then finally, that casino core. And as you can see from the density of the surface parking lots, their priority is efficiency and flow of vehicular traffic to their parking lots and to their front doors. So our task is trying to align all of these groups around a central idea and a Main Street concept. So we began by listening to the community, to a large stakeholder group, and started to prioritize and establish measurable goals along the way. Again, everyone was aligned around this idea of creating a much stronger pedestrian environment, one where it could provide a new identity for South Lake Tahoe. This all resulted in 5 main priorities, mainly focused around providing places for people and increasing accessibility and mobility. As we all know, working on projects like this, rarely is the street cross-section the same. This is a mile-long corridor, and we had 3 very distinctive existing conditions to deal with. And so, so that was one of our main focuses, was trying to figure out how to create continuity through this entire mile-long corridor. We tested a lot of the ideas. We turned to the community to test these concepts and get some new perspectives. Specifically, we learned, shockingly enough to me, that on-street parking did not actually score very high in the list of priorities for the community. They wanted this significant road diet and more space for bike and micromobility and pedestrians. This resulted in a number of different iterations in how we try to connect these spaces together, but ultimately into this systems diagram. From a systems perspective, we were looking at substantial improvements to the pedestrian accessibility of the Main Street through the addition of signalized crossings and wider sidewalks. We reduced the crossing distance within the core from 600 feet to 250 feet, making it a much more walkable place, and making walkability more enticing for user groups. With relationship to the bicycle network, there is currently a regional bicycle facility that circumnavigates the entire lake, but it was fragmented through this section. It didn't continue through the casino core. So first we had to accommodate that regional facility, and then provided additional, more recreational bike mobility throughout the corridor as well. PMDs, as they're likely hot everywhere, interestingly enough, many of the PMD companies actually did a lot of their prototyping and testing in South Lake Tahoe. So there's kind of a long history of PMDs in the town. And so just the 2 largest complaints with PMDs right now is where do they belong? Do they belong on the sidewalks or in the streets? And why can't we design a series of corrals or something to congregate these when they're not in use? And do that in a way that it doesn't take up space away from the pedestrian sidewalk circulation. In addition, if you've been to Tahoe, they have bumper stickers all over that say "Keep Lake Tahoe Blue." So water quality and detention had to be thought of simultaneously. And why I bring it up is because the real estate needed for that sometimes was in competition with our other project goals and priorities. And so this was a challenging thing for us to do to make sure that we're trying to incorporate all of these things into one. Ultimately, the single largest impact to accessibility and the character of Main Street is the diversion of the traffic around Main Street. So that's this proposed route around here. And you'll see here, the proposed condition that includes the bypass. This allows us to close a number of vehicular curb cuts and reduce conflict points along the corridor. And as we start to zoom in here, you can start to see some of the improvements. We're going to look at this in the 3 segments again. The gateway zone, which is the much more kind of community-based zone. Here's where we are incorporating elements of the continuous bike lanes, the much improved and increased pedestrian and public realm, and allowing for more transit facility access. In the village core, the things become a little more complex. It's important, again, to note the community and the stakeholders voted loud and clear that they were not interested in on-street parking, which is contrary to what we typically like to do in a main street for both traffic calming and just for access and the activation of some of that ground floor retail. So that was foreign to us. But I think whenever we presented it and we showed the expanded curb to curb, people had such an adverse reaction to more pavement. And so a massive road diet was on everybody's mind here to go from the 5-lane cross section down to as narrow as they possibly could. And I know this is small to read, you probably can't read it on the screen, but there are a few things that I'd highlight. The rideshare drop-off and pickup was an important component here. The real transit facilities that we were able to add in here. And then, as I mentioned before, the ability to bring in mid-block crossings to really promote and expand the walkability of the place. You can see some of those improvements here. We also had an opportunity to expand the outdoor dining. This all happened pre-COVID, so while it made sense then, it makes even more sense now to provide those spaces that don't actually impede on the pedestrian space. In the casino core, this is the most challenging section because Nevada did not have the same level of setbacks that were required in the other cores. And so the right-of-way distance is much tighter. Something had to give, and in a lot of cases, we had to get rid of the green stormwater infrastructure so that we could still have that continuity of the regional bike facilities and the localized bike facilities, as well as some increased pedestrian space along the way. We were able to also add an additional crossing here, further reducing that crossing distance to something a little bit more approachable, which was around 250 feet or so, as opposed to like 600 feet. Hanging up here, sorry. Sorry for the delay here. Well, maybe I'll just, oh, here we go. Okay, so the last couple slides I just wanted to cover was this idea that because we were able to reduce the overall cross section and do a road diet here and really divert that throughput traffic of vehicles and deliveries and all that kind of stuff around Main Street, we were able to then focus on bringing people back to the street and changing the attitude of how people saw the street. And we found ways to create these scenarios where we were doing festivals within the street. And of course, that meant making sure that we accommodated both the service delivery, the emergency delivery, all of those things on event days, whether it was occurring in the California side or in the Nevada side. So just some ideas about how we event those spaces. And then we were also thinking about programmatic things and accessible items that we actually could build in into the street network. And again, if you look at, what does that look like circulation wise in terms of if there's just a Nevada event, how do vehicles move around? How does service happen? How does emergency access happen? Because things do happen on the one state or the other state side regularly, we had to plan it that way. And then sometimes it happens across the whole network. So with that, I will conclude and I'll pass my time off to, I think, Maddie.
Thank you, Rob. That was really informative. So our next presenters are Kimberly Leung and Maddie Ruvolo. Kimberly is an engineer at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, working to transform streets to be safe and inviting for people who bike and walk. She oversees the development and implementation of street safety improvements in the Tenderloin neighborhood as part of the San Francisco's COVID-19 response, and previously served as the Slow Streets Program Manager. She has also managed the Valencia Bikeway Improvements Project since 2017. Kimberly is an active leader of transportation community and is the 2021 Institute of Transportation Engineers Western District Secretary Treasurer. And Maddie is a transportation planner on the Accessible Services team at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. Her work focuses on active transportation and emerging mobility access for disability community. She has also worked for the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and the Oakland Department of Transportation. Maddie began her career in disability rights organization and brings her lived experience with disability to all facets of her work. And with that, Kimberly and Maddie, you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Susan. I will just share my screen. All right, so hi everyone, and welcome to Designing for Accessibility and Mobility, a San Francisco case study. My name is Maddie Ruvolo, and I'm a planner on the Accessible Services team at the SFMTA. I'm here with my colleague, Kimberly Leung, who is an engineer and team leader in the Livable Streets section. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about our approach to accessible design, and then Kimberly will share a case study and discuss how we implement accessible design principles into our projects. Let's begin with some history, because it's important to remember that transportation accessibility comes out of the disability rights movement and activism by people with disabilities. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a series of protests by disability activists led to increased transportation access, culminating in the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Highlights included a 28-day sit-in at the San Francisco Federal Building, the longest occupation of a federal building in US history, in support of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which stipulated that any entity receiving federal funds may not discriminate against people with disabilities. Transportation was a major target of these actions. At the time, buses did not have lifts or ramps, making it impossible for riders who use wheelchairs to board or exit independently. Stop announcements that are so important for people who are blind or low vision were not widespread. The activist group ADAPT, which stood for Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, protested outside of transportation conferences like APTA and chained their wheelchairs to buses in pursuit of accessible transit. And at least a few of the original curb ramps in Berkeley were originally constructed by wheelchair users and their allies who poured concrete in the middle of the night to construct makeshift ramps. So the transportation field has come a long way over the past half century, but 30 years after the signing of the ADA, we still have a lot of work to do. That being said, we're very proud of the legacy of activism and accessibility in San Francisco. Bruce Oka, for example, who is the gentleman in the wheelchair in the top right photo, was an active participant in the 504 sit-in and is a current member of our Paratransit Coordinating Council. If you don't know the disability activists in your own cities, we encourage you to seek them out. They have a wealth of knowledge and information and are key partners in making the transportation network more accessible. So here's a little bit about our approach to accessibility. We work together with stakeholders to deliver transportation options that meet the disability community's needs across the entire transportation network. We want our customers with disabilities, older adults, and everyone traveling in San Francisco for that matter, to have options for how they travel. And we want to ensure that they know what's available to them. We approach our projects with universal design principles. Universal design is the design of an environment so that it can be accessed and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of disability, age, and so on. The term was coined by architect Ronald Mace, who was a wheelchair user. And in transportation, we sometimes talk about an 8 to 80 approach, designing infrastructure that can be used by people across generations, people ages 8 to 80. Universal design is an even more expansive concept, and it centers disability. And of course, when we design for accessibility, everyone benefits. This is known as the curb cut effect. Curb cuts or curb ramps make streets accessible for people with disabilities by providing a ramp transition from the sidewalk to the street. But curb ramps also benefit parents with strollers, people with luggage, and so on. Design that is usable, legible, and accessible for people with disabilities is design that works better for everyone. In San Francisco, one of the tools we've used to put these principles into practice is the Getting to the Curb design guide. This guide, which was released by Walk San Francisco, came out of a design charrette with advocates from Walk SF, the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, a number of disability rights organizations, and city staff. The guide contains a series of design principles for building protected bike lanes that are safe and accessible for everyone. We have resources linked at the end of the presentation if you want to check it out. And now to discuss how we've operationalized this guide, Kimberly will share a case study from her work on Valencia Street.
All right, thank you, Maddie. Let me just advance the next slide here. I think it's stuck. There we go. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Kimberly Leung, and I'm an engineer with the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. I'm also the project manager for the Valencia Bikeway Improvements Project, which I've managed since 2017. So we're going to be using this project to kind of showcase some of the principles from the Getting to the Curb design guide. And I do really want to emphasize that, with Valencia Street, it's not just simply an 8 to 80, bike facility that we're trying to design here. The MTA really does try to include accessibility for all users, whether you're traveling by car, transit, foot, or bike, into our project. I mean, this definitely includes people who do have disabilities or are a part of our senior population. So Valencia has been this constantly evolving roadway. The bike lanes that you see in the photos here, these are first striped in 1999. And today, Valencia is one of our major north-south bike routes, extending about 2 miles. And it's one of the busiest bike facilities in San Francisco with over 2,100 cyclists on an average weekday. So through the years, Valencia has seen many improvements for both cyclists and pedestrians. Some of those include the green wave bicycle signal timing of 13 miles per hour, which was put in 2009. There was also a sidewalk widening that happened on 4 blocks where we widened it from 10 to 15 feet. And Valencia also has a number of parklets as well as bike share stations. But even with all these improvements along the corridor, there's definitely still room for change. And in fall of 2018, our mayor, London Breed, directed the MTA to really expedite the Valencia Bikeway Improvements Project and to go ahead and design and implement a protected bikeway pilot on the northern end. And she wanted this done within 4 months. So this is what Valencia looks like today, now that this protected bikeway pilot is in. This is a very typical parking protected bikeway design that you'll see here in San Francisco. What you see here is a 7-foot wide bike lane, a 5-foot buffer with delineators, also known as safe-hits, and then next to that is an 8-foot parking. And I just really wanted to set the stage for what this type of design looks like before I dive into some of the design challenges, including curb and sidewalk access, and how do we create safe crossings across this type of bikeway design. So I want to first dive into some of the challenges related to curb and sidewalk access. So one of the first things that we typically hear about is just really trying to ensure that safe path of travel a safe path of travel from a parked vehicle and trying to get the folks over to the curb. So one of the things that we do try to emphasize in our designs is to make that buffer between the bikeway as well as the parking at least 5 feet minimum. If there's room on the roadway, we definitely want to make that wider if we can. Another challenge that we hear about are, delays in that buffer, blocking the curb access or even impeding movement within the buffer itself. And this is where we have to be really deliberate about the type of safe hits that we're using as well as their placement. So there's a variety of safe hits that you can use. There's single safe hits, there's types with longer bases, and there's different ways that you can choose to use them in a bikeway design. For example, in an area where you have parking or loading happening next to a bikeway, you wouldn't want to use a whole row of safe hits and not allow any gaps. We want to make sure that there's gaps so that people can get in and out of their cars. Another thing with these safe hit placement is that when it's within a buffer, it's really important to figure out whether or not you want to put it in the center of the buffer or on the edge of the buffer. So again, if there's parking or loading happening, you wouldn't want those safe hits running down the middle of that buffer. But if it's a situation where there's an active travel lane and no cars should be in that area, it may make sense to have that safe hit in the center. So there's just this really sweet spot that you kind of need to figure out in terms of that spacing between your safe hits, because you want to make sure that pedestrians are able to travel from the vehicle to the curb, but you also want to make sure that you're discouraging vehicles from encroaching into that buffer. A third challenge that we hear about is mid-block sidewalk access from the roadway. So once we establish that safe path of travel in that buffer, we need to still somehow get people safely across the bikeway. And this is where design elements such as a mid-block curb ramp or even raised crosswalks could be very helpful. I do want to acknowledge that these types of improvements do require more capital. So in projects where we're trying to do quick improvements, we do have a quick build program in San Francisco. These new improvements may not necessarily be timed well with the implementation of a quick build project, but it's something that we definitely commit to and bring forth later on in the project. And for those of you that aren't familiar with quick build projects, what these are is that they're reversible and really adjustable traffic safety improvements using really cheap materials. We use paint, traffic delineators, street signs, making parking and loading adjustments. And it's typically installed with a 24-month period where we commit to evaluating and reviewing it just to make sure that this design works really well. And typically a quick build comes before a larger capital improvement project is done. So the next design challenges that I want to talk about relate to safe crossings across a protected bikeway. So two of the key challenges that we hear about is the visibility of the crossing as well as bicycle speed management. So to help with the visibility of crossings, this is where there's an opportunity to use pavement markings to make sure that we have highly visible continental crosswalks. There's opportunities here to use stencils. I'll show you a little bit more in the next few slides about these look stencils that we've been using in our crosswalks here. With these crossings, this is also where truncated domes at the mid-block curb ramps would be really helpful in helping particularly those that are visually impaired. In terms of bicycle speed management, again, there's definitely opportunities here to do pavement markings such as yield tees or slow head crossing stencils just to give cyclists warnings that there is a crossing coming up ahead. Signage is also another tool that we use. Another thing related to this is that there is an opportunity here to narrow the bike lanes adjacent to the loading islands to really encourage cyclists to go slower or to even go single file when approaching a potential crosswalk. So I want to go back to some photos of the Valencia project as it looks today to kind of show you how we've incorporated some of these design approaches into our project. So first off, I just want to draw your attention to the different delineators and their placement used throughout the project. So in areas, again, where there's parking and loading, you'll notice that the safe hits are purposely placed farther to the edge of the buffer to make sure that vehicles are able to, or people are able to enter and exit their vehicles. And it's also close enough to the edge that it's going to prevent vehicles from wanting to enter the buffer or into the bikeway. So with this type of spacing, it provides a little bit more space for bikes. It provides a safe path of travel for pedestrians. And of course, we did make sure to make this at least 5 feet. And with this type of design, we're also providing easier access overall for passenger and commercial loading needs. One of the other things about this design is that in the case of a paratransit vehicle, if they do need to pull to the curb, they are able to kind of navigate their way through those safe hits and pull curbside to help load or unload any passengers. You'll notice in the bottom right photo, This is a situation where the buffer is adjacent to an active travel lane. So you'll see that we chose to use safe hits that had a wider base, and we chose to put those into the center of the buffer itself. There is the option here to actually even connect your safe hits just to kind of create a greater, I guess, kind of like a wall effect between the bikeway and the travel lane. But in this case, we chose to provide some spacing because we felt that this was adequate enough to provide that protection for our cyclists. So in our top photo here, you can see where we've decided to create mid-block sidewalk access for people that are moving from their cars to the curb. So these are some of the new curb ramps that we chose to build as a part of our project. We committed to building new curb ramps for every new floating passenger loading zone as well as blue zone. And of course, we weren't able to get these done within the 4-month period just due to the design and construction that's needed for it. But it was something that quickly followed the implementation of our quick build project. And with that crosswalk there, you can see that we chose to do a continental crosswalk. There is a look stencil in here. You can't quite see it in this photo, but you'll see it in the next slide. And with this curb ramp, there were truncated domes included. So in this next slide here, I want to talk through one of the newest things that we chose to do as a part of this project. So in one block of Valencia, there are 2 schools that are located on opposite sides of the street. Both of these schools serve elementary as well as middle school students. So as a part of this project, we did hear a number of concerns from parents. They were concerned about their students crossing that bikeway. So one of the things that we chose to do in this project was to actually construct concrete loading islands with an accessible path as well as a railing to really help channelize students or any passengers to designated crossing points. And this is really building upon that transit island concept that we already had in San Francisco, but we made some tweaks to it to really work better for the students in this area. So you'll notice that the railings on the backside, they have very few gaps, and they're very small gaps because we wanted to make sure that this wasn't something where students could climb through or cut through. So we wanted to make sure that we were really addressing the safety concerns when it came to students. And in these photos here, you can see that the crossings were really made visible using, again, these high visibility continental crosswalks. You can see the look stencils in that middle photo on the bottom there. And then for the cyclists, we made sure to have head warning signs, a school crossing pavement message, as well as yield T, so they knew where to stop and that they were aware of an upcoming crossing. So with the mid-block curb ramps here, again, we chose to use truncated domes just to make sure that those who are visually impaired were able to get safely from the sidewalk to the loading island. And you'll notice here that the gap in our island is a little bit wider than you would anticipate for a typical crosswalk, and this was intentional. The reason that we designed it in this way was that we wanted to make sure that we were also creating a wide enough flat area so that in the case that a paratransit vehicle pulled up here, there was enough space for them to deploy their ramp. And in terms of bike speed management here, we did narrow the bikeway as it went behind the loading island. The bikeway was designed for 7 feet, but once you're behind the island, it was reduced to 6 feet. So with that 6 feet along with that railing to the left side of you, it really encouraged you to bike slower and to go single file, which we felt really helped with the safety of the students crossing this bikeway. So since this is a newer design that we hadn't done in San Francisco yet, we made sure to fully evaluate it. So we did do an evaluation in the summer and also in the fall of 2019, and there were no close calls observed at the school loading island. We did see that the number of interactions between cyclists and pedestrians did increase, but in general, bikes were yielding to pedestrians. So we felt that this was a successful design that is now being used on other bike corridors in the city. And for anyone here that may be more interested in the nitty-gritty details of the loading islands, I did provide some engineering drawings here, but just from a very high level, these islands were designed to be 6 feet wide, and they were actually doweled into the roadway, so we didn't actually have to do any excavation or of any sort. The railings itself were made from galvanized pipe, and we made sure to have sleeves in the island itself when we were constructing with the concrete, just so that we can make sure we can just kind of pop those railings right in. And all this work was done in-house by our public works crews. And just the last thing that I wanted to share regarding this project is that, as a part of all this work that we were doing, we always make sure to do a full evaluation of our projects. We wanted to take a look at the behavior that was happening out there, whether or not this was actually an effective design, and how this project was helping with mobility and even the perceived comfort out there. So, again, we really wanted to go back and take a look at some of the design challenges and approaches that we were using when it came to the curb and sidewalk access, as well as safe crossings. So with this project, there were a lot of iterative changes that did happen later on, especially through the outreach and evaluation. And we really wanted to hear about people's experience. So, throughout the project, we made other changes, including, adjusting the color curbs to better meet the needs of merchants and residents. We installed parking tees adjacent to those loading islands just to really clarify that space between the parking lane versus the travel lane. And then all those improvements that you saw with the school loading islands, those all didn't come at once. When we initially installed the project, we had the green bikeway and we had the crosswalks. But it was over time that we decided to add the yield piece, to add the look stencil and the warning messages. So we just really wanted to continue making sure that was a safe place for children to cross. And then, of course, the curb ramps, which I've mentioned a few times, but those didn't come in at the start of the project, but it was something that we committed to doing, particularly for our passenger loading zones and blue zones. So just with this overall Valencia project, again, it was a bikeway project, which is how this project started, but we wanted to make sure that as a part of our design, we were being inclusive and making sure that we were providing accessibility and mobility options for all users of this corridor. So with that, I just wanted to provide you some of the resources from our presentation today. There's the Getting to the Curb guide, building blocks for accessible design, as well as the website for the Valencia Bikeway project. And then this is the contact information for Maddie and me. So thank you very much for having us today.
Thank you, Kimberly and Maddie. And thank you to Rob for really all of you, such a informative and thorough presentations. We can dive into discussions right now and then take a few questions from the audience afterwards. But I guess the first question that we can discuss is almost every city is projected to have groundswell increase in older citizens over the next 10, 20 years. So what do you think are some examples that cities are thinking about or implementing already to improve accessibility for this growing population, really?
Well, Maddie, did you want to jump in first?
Oh, you can go ahead. I'll go ahead.
Okay, I would just say from what we're seeing in terms of public realm design, we're seeing incorporating minimum seating requirements to provide respite within the public realm, and that's not something that we had probably planned for or saw before. And then I thought Kimberly and Maddie's presentation was so great. I think one thing that we've seen being incorporated more and more are these dedicated drop-off zones, so the loading zones. So getting rid of a few on-street parking spaces and actually incorporating those dedicated loading zones. And I think that, as it relates to an older population, I think that becomes more and more important.
Yeah, I was also going to talk about loading zones just because we know as folks get older, sometimes they're not driving, but are often being driven by other people. And so having access to those zones is really important. And then, getting back to sort of what we were talking about with the universal design concepts, that if we design all of our projects to be accessible from the get-go, then they should work for older adults and people with disabilities and everyone. And of course, we'll need to be in communication with older adults. We'll need to talk to these folks to understand what their needs are. And of course, the population of folks who are sort of aging into that older adult designation may have different needs and desires than the prior generations of older adults. We know that as baby boomers become the older adults, they might be more familiar with using technology. They might want to receive information about transportation systems in a different way. And so it's going to be really important to continue that communication with them to make sure we understand what they need.
Sounds like everyone already talked about loading zones, but that's what I was going to offer as well. But a little bit of a different perspective. I know that the amount of curb space that we have is very limited. So some of the things that we've been doing here in San Francisco is doing these dual use loading zones where, depending on time of day, it could be a passenger loading zone or a commercial loading zone. But again, always with those types of designs, making sure that we build that curb ramp or whatever we need to make sure that it's fully accessible for all users. But I think that's how we're kind of getting creative with our limited space out there, is how can we have, how can we repurpose it or maybe have dual purposes for, what we have available.
I think it's
Great.
also interesting, just from—
No, please go ahead.
We do a fair amount of private work as well, so private development. And even in the private development world, whether it's a mixed use development or a residential or something like that, or office, we are getting more and more requests to make sure that we're incorporating these loading zones into the streetscapes. Because as someone pointed out in the chat panel, it's not just for older individuals, but it's deliveries. And especially if you're doing a multifamily project or a mixed use project that has any level of residential, I think those loading zones are critical now, more so than the value that once was placed on that parallel parking space. So.
So kind of shifting gears a bit, and this goes off of what Maddie, you were saying. Obviously, COVID-19 took a toll on a lot of people, and unfortunately, elderly adults were definitely impacted with this. And so since we are also speaking of accessibility, how do you think in this kind of realm it's shaping the works to come when it comes to street design? Do you see that in terms of all of your work, you're taking into consideration, obviously, the ramification of COVID-19?
Well, I'll start. And again, a lot of our work is just focused within that public realm zone. And what we saw in Denver and in Houston and some of our, larger cities was this taking back of the public realm, and the debate about taking back the public realm even for private use. We have a great street in Denver called Larimer Street, and they barricaded the street and provided zones for the restaurants to do outdoor dining, which was extremely successful, I think. But then immediately there became a debate on should that public right-of-way be used for private gain. And so I think there's still a lot to figure out there. But the thing, one of the effects of COVID in terms of public realm design is the ability for flexibility. And where we used to be designing every square inch, making sure that we had everything perfectly designed, now it's trying to be more flexible and be able to respond to seasonality and the ability to take over those spaces for different programmatic uses.
Yeah, I can add that, in San Francisco, we do have a neighborhood, the Tenderloin neighborhood, that has been heavily impacted during COVID-19. So just a little context about this neighborhood. Every single street in that neighborhood is on the high energy network. It's also a community of concern. So, the Tenderloin has some of our most vulnerable communities and historically marginalized groups. There's people with disabilities, residents of SROs, and supportive housing. And one of the things that we've done in this community is that we've gone in and created what we are calling physical distancing lanes, where we're really repurposing that parking strip and just creating more space for people to walk in this neighborhood. I should have pointed out this neighborhood mostly gets around by walking and transit. So we wanted to make sure that we were creating networks in this community where during this time people can get out and get their essential services and just be able to just kind of get some space from their houses. So one of the things that we did was create this space. So for example, there's a roadway that previously had parking on both sides of the street and 3 lanes of travel. In order to create this space, we went ahead and did a road diet, brought it down to 2 lanes, took out parking on one side of the street and put up K-rail, and now it's an extension of the sidewalk essentially. So we've had to get creative with how we're going to create more space for people to get around in this community during this time. And there's a lot of questions now, like, is there a path to permanence for this? People want to know if this will stay after COVID. I think it's really changing the landscape of our projects. really trying to look into, say, sidewalk extensions and just creating that space for people.
Got it. Thank you both. Well, I guess a couple years ago, there was kind of this debate whether bike lanes should be renamed to be more inclusive of micromobility modes. So in 10, 20 years, when e-scooters and e-bikes and other micromobility options do take off, hopefully, do you imagine these modes would be separated or all lumped together in kind of a wider bike lanes?
Kimberly, why don't you go ahead and go first?
This is a tough question. I mean, I've gotten this question quite a bit, particularly with my work on the Valencia project. I think, in San Francisco, we have very limited right of way. So we're just trying to maximize all the space that we can get. But, in the last couple of years, we've really had e-bikes coming through as a part of our bike share system. And, with these, protected bikeway designs, you can potentially ride side by side in some of our designs, but people have asked, how are you going to deal with, all these kind of, electric assist or, motorized forms of transportation that are coming through. And, I really don't have a great answer for that, to be honest. Just that limit of right of way just makes it really hard for us to, expand that bikeway. But at the same time, I do understand that you're not going quite as fast as a car, so you may not be comfortable being in that vehicle lane. So I don't have a great answer, but it's definitely a question that I've been asked, and we are thinking about it when it comes to our, our bikeway design projects, or maybe it won't be called a bikeway in a few years from now, but yes.
Yeah, and I would say, 10 and 20 years is probably way too long of a horizon. We're seeing this stuff right now in all of our cities. I know in Denver and Houston and other locations where LA, where we work, they're already here. There's 5 different companies that do the scooters and a number of different companies that do the bikes. And so we've got to accommodate these now. The example project that I used in South Lake Tahoe, it was interesting because the company Lime brought scooters to South Lake Tahoe 2 years prior to them being kind of wildly available throughout the country, just to see if they could increase mobility and walkability as an alternative, a mode of sort of mobility and transportation. And as we all know, that these things have helped immensely in the last mile coordination between transit stops and whether your destination is home or work or whatever. So in the Tahoe example, it was clear that the stakeholders in the community really wanted to separate the electric assist modes from the more casual bike commuter, and so we had the luxury, to Kimberly's point, you don't always have the luxury, but we had the luxury of almost excess right of way because we did a pretty serious road diet on that project, and so we were relegating the PMDs, as we call them, or these scooters and things, to the street-based bike lanes or shared lanes, and then we made sure and designed the sidewalks to be shared with, so that we could accommodate bikes in those conditions as well. So it was a little bit easier on that project, and I know that we don't have that luxury on most projects. So
yeah, I mean, as both Kimberly and Rob have said, the constricted street space does make things difficult, but I do think it is really important for all of these modes to have safe and protected infrastructure. So just to use myself as an example, so I have a disability, I have a chronic illness. And so for me, riding a standard bike is not always accessible, but riding an e-bike is awesome. And so, I want to be able to use a protected bike lane because I wouldn't feel safe riding an e-bike in the street. And so I think, it's tricky, and it is really hard to project what is going to be on our streets 10 and 20 years from now. But I do think keeping these principles of we want to make sure that there are protected spaces for vulnerable road users is really important.
Yes, thank you, Maddie. And to your point, we did receive a question from the audience, and They were saying we would love to hear more about how to involve those with disabilities in the design process, but also education post implementation. So do you all kind of have an input on that aspect?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think in terms of including people with disabilities in the design process, that starts probably by reaching out to disability organizations in your community, getting to know them, building relationships with them, and then trying to bring folks into the design process as early as possible. And so that can look like having folks with a variety of disabilities come out onto the street with you and do sort of a tour and see, you know, here's what the potential project might look like, here's what we're thinking, here are the options, and getting people's input. Because I know, I mean, people have such a variety of experiences and disabilities. And I think really the only way to make sure you're truly covering your bases is to get input from as many different people as possible. And so making sure people are involved from the beginning so that you're not just coming to people with an almost complete project hoping to get their, you know, check off, you know, that makes things difficult to work with people, because often I've been in situations where people have said, wow, this project is really not accessible. But then by the time you're at that point in the design stage, it's a whole large, long, and potentially very expensive process to change things. And so it's really, if you make something accessible from the get-go, then it generally doesn't cost any more. But if you have to go back afterwards because you've made a mistake and it's not accessible, that can add a lot of time and capital to your project. So yeah, I think starting by building relationships and then also making sure people are involved from the get-go.
Got it. Thank you. And would you say, are there engineering design standards for bike lanes that incorporate the elements discussed today?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question one more time?
So are there engineering design standards for bike lanes that incorporate the elements that you all discussed today?
Yeah, so the NACDO Urban Bikeway Design Guide is a great manual that we refer to quite a bit. They also have kind of a secondary guide. It's I think it's called Don't Give Up at the Intersection. It's really talking about how do you do bikeway design through an intersection, because that's where things get very complicated and very dicey. But those are kind of like my two go-tos when I'm doing bikeway design. I don't think you'll find as much information in more of the traditional traffic and transportation engineering manual. So NACDO has kind of been our go-to for that.
Got it. So audience questions. This one goes for Maddie and Kimberly. Does SFMTA analyze accessibility by race and ethnicity, as Black, Indigenous, and people of color are often left out of this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we collect survey data and we survey our disability community, we do collect demographic data. And so we do look at people's responses by race. But I think that this gets to the larger issue that oftentimes when people are talking about accessibility in the transportation world, they have a specific image of who they're thinking about in their mind. And even without maybe thinking about it, it's usually a white man who's a wheelchair user. And so really expanding our own ideas about what disability looks like, what people's disability experiences are, of course, the intersectionality of disability and people's experiences with ableism and racism and other experiences that people have in public space is really key to this conversation and to our work. And I think that's something that we take really seriously, but there's a lot more work to be done there.
Great, thank you. Rob, you spoke about how in your two examples, it was necessary for your team to work with large stakeholder groups, sometimes with competing interests. So can you share a little bit more on tips or methods you utilize to either build consensus or facilitate these really difficult conversations?
Yeah, sure. And I'm sure Maddie and Kimberly deal with this on a daily basis as well. There's always competing interests. And I think, you know, in the Lake Tahoe example, you had a perfect storm of all kinds of things. You had two different states. You had a multitude of different private organizations, like the casinos versus the resort versus some of the smaller mom and pop retail versus the community. And you had two different state highway organizations as well, departments of transportation. And when it came to like snow removal or service, that kind of stuff, like their policies were completely opposite. So the thing that helped us on that project, and again, we came in after about 20 years worth of EIS work and all kinds of other stuff that led to at least even starting this conversation, was establishing really strong measurable goals from the onset and things that we all could get behind. And that became our metric as we were having to work through certain things. Mobility, access, and specifically kind of bike circulation were some of our most, or our highest priorities. So when we faced challenges like the casino core, which had a really narrow right-of-way, where we didn't have space to also do the green infrastructure and things like that, we basically looked back at our priorities and we said, okay, well, we have to do these three things first. And if there's room, then we move on to 4, 5, and so on and so forth. So I think that has a big role in how we make those decisions. Clear and transparent decision making is always key in those situations, because at some point you're going to offend someone or not include someone, and so you just have to be very transparent and document everything. But it all starts with kind of clear vision and goals, I think, that help guide the rest of the project.
Great, thank you, Rob. So at Transportation Alternatives, we often hear pushback on pedestrian, bike, and public transit improvements on the basis, really, and on the basis that people with disabilities need cars to get around. And so therefore, taking away car space will discriminate against the disabled community. So can you talk about how other modes of transportation may figure into how people with disabilities get around?
Sure. I know this is, I think, a contentious issue, but I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of people with disabilities who get around by car, but most people with disabilities don't drive, and most people with disabilities are low income, and so they may not have access to vehicles for that reason as well. And so it is really important to make sure that when we're building projects, we make space that is accessible for disabled pedestrians, disabled transit riders, and there are disabled cyclists as well. There are accessible cycles, there are like hand cycles, or there's a variety of different form factors. And some people with disabilities find cycling more accessible than walking or using a wheelchair in some cases. And so, yeah, I think disabled people are often used as a rhetorical football in these kinds of conversations. I think, I don't know, at least in San Francisco, seniors and people with disabilities make up at least 1/5 of our muni ridership. So that by itself just goes to show you how people with disabilities are often using these alternate modes of transportation and are not just getting around by car.
Great, thank you. So Rob, this one is for you, and it's really questioning, how do you and your team balance the need of the community and also the needs of the tourist industry?
Ooh, that's a tough one. We do a fair amount of work in resort community type places. Like we have an office in Aspen. We do a lot of mountain work, but then we also do sort of warm weather climate stuff too. And I'll just go back to the Tahoe example because now people sort of know that. We had to balance parking availability for local residents versus tourism. We had to balance obviously roadway congestion and transit access as well, and then also the kind of public realm prioritization for both visitors and residents. The challenge is that a lot of times the reason why we can afford to do what we can afford to do is because of the sales tax revenues that come in from the tourism. And so that provides us the capital to make the improvements. But people have to live there, they work there, they're the reason why there is a place there. And so I don't have a great answer for you, but I can just tell you it's not easy. It's always a balance. The other side of this, and I was reading a comment in the chat as well, trying to balance who has access to these community events and our listening sessions. And it's interesting because, as someone suggested, typically it's the cyclists. Like, out of all the people that come to our community events, it's either somebody that's really frustrated and wants to get their voice across, or it's the cycling community that wants to advocate on behalf of the cyclists. Rarely do we see this even proportion across the board. And when it comes to kind of tourism versus local resident, we don't have the tourism perspective present at these community events. We just have the local perspective. So it takes a balancing act to try to balance all of that together. In a similar way that, if you were working in another community where you didn't feel like you had both sides of the story, you have to use a little bit of judgment on that as well.
Great, thank you, Rob. So this really goes for all of you. Do you all kind of have some thoughts about adapting accessibility design for local conditions? So such as hills in San Francisco and snow in Denver?
Yeah, Kimberly, why don't you go first on, I'm sure you guys do that for San Francisco.
So sorry, my reception's a little off right now. Could you repeat the question? Sorry, I'm like.
No worries. Yeah, sure. So it's what are your thoughts about adapting accessibility design for local conditions? So such as hills in San Francisco and for Rob, snow in Denver.
Oh yeah, so I guess if we're talking about accessibility in the sense of just mobility and connectivity, when we're looking at, say, bicycle network planning, that is definitely something that we have to take into consideration, the grades of our roadway, what is the flattest route, for a cyclist to take. And that's something that we've really been trying to put together. We have a fairly robust bike network, but some of these, bikeways are on streets that do have higher traffic volume. So there are things that we've been doing, like, for example, we have a Slow Streets program that went into place during COVID, where we are deterring vehicles from going down some of these quieter, smaller streets, and really encouraging a whole new generation of people to ride their bikes out there. And now we're trying to figure out, how do you kind of integrate that, aspect of Slow Streets program into the bigger bicycle network that we have in San Francisco, and that way you're able to attract cyclists of all ages and abilities. So that's something that we definitely have been looking into. But yes, in San Francisco, those hills, they get you every time. So it's a big part of our bicycle network planning.
Yeah, and I would just say, when it comes to snow, it's really about removal and storage and how that all happens. And I know that's kind of more of a technical answer, but a lot of times when we're designing the right-of-way, kind of the streetscape design, specifically in cold weather climates, we're looking for places to store that snow so that it can be removed from the bikeways and the sidewalks and go to some place that has the ability to do water quality and snow storage and even water detention in those areas. So that's where our bioswales and our bioplanters come into play.
Great, thank you. So Kimberly, an interesting question from our audience, and they stated the color of Save Hit in San Francisco is not aesthetically pleasing as it gets dingy over time. Has the MTA considered another color such as yellow?
So we choose to use the white safe hit post because it matches the color of the roadway striping there. So like in those buffers where we do have white striping, we want to use a color that matches that. Although I do understand that the maintenance of those are just, they just don't look great after a while. But one of the things too is that, for these types of projects where we are, installing safe hit posts, like say in our buffers, the intention is that eventually these pilot projects or these quick build projects will become long-term capital improvement projects. So for example, you saw in that Valencia project where there's some areas where we have already constructed loading islands, and that's kind of taking the place of what would have been like a painted buffer. So in the future, the hope is that we can really upgrade that entire bikeway and install something a little more concrete or robust, like maybe even actually installing a concrete island of some sort. So these safe hit posts aren't really meant to be a permanent long-term measure. The hope is that we will have the funds and the design to move to a more permanent installation. But I definitely hear that comment quite a bit about how just the maintenance of these safe hit posts and some of those elements we put out there, they just don't keep, very well.
Great, thank you. Our audience have great questions. Another one for all of you, really. The question states, in our city, the Greenways Commission deactivated scooters on greenways, but this has become an issue as folks were using them for first/last mile. Mm-hmm. How have other cities handled scooters on greenways?
Yeah, I'll jump in. That's been a common theme. We're doing some work on the Atlanta Beltline right now, and we've worked on greenways in Austin and Texas, Austin and in Houston. And in all cases, they've either drastically reduced the traveling speed, so they bring it down to, I don't know, 5 miles an hour or something like that. Just an annoying enough to still stay on your scooter, but not quite give up. But it's under this idea that they didn't want people traveling at 20 miles an hour and having that conflict between much slower moving people. So it's definitely happening. It also is happening, again, I just go back to that, the Tahoe example, because all this stuff can be controlled electronically. They have the ability to do dead zones at different times of the day and year and all that kind of stuff. So when festivals are happening in the street, the thought was that this would become a dead zone and those would not happen. It's an issue though, because if people rely on those and don't have a bike and don't have other means of transportation, it then becomes a walkability issue and a desirability issue for transit, and people start thinking twice about using transit. So
great, thank you. And as we are out of time, I will take the last question. And Maddie, if you can help with this, this question states, is there a resource that shows data that people with disabilities use multiple modes of transit? As an able-bodied person, I want to refer to something that comes from the disabled community to accurately represent that community.
It's a good question. One of the issues that the disability community faces is that there isn't a lot of really good data collected on people with disabilities. There's some census data on how people with disabilities travel, and there was some, what is it, the NHTS, the National Household Travel Survey data. There's some specifically on how people with disabilities travel. So those are probably the go-tos, but I think it's useful to survey people in your communities if that's something that you have access to understand the specific local context of how people are getting around. But if you're looking for general data on how people with disabilities in the US travel, probably like census data, ACS data, and NHTS data are your best bets.
Great, thank you, Maddie. And I just want to say a really big thank you to Rob, Kimberly, and Maddie. This has been a great, enjoyable discussion. And I really want to thank our attendees for joining us today. I just want to say, please tune into our third session of Vision Zero Cities Pop-Up Designing for Quick Builds, which starts at 4:15. But thank you to our panelists, and we really look forward to seeing you in future conferences, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.